They fired her at 9:14 in the morning. By 9:31, a four-star general was dying on a gurney 17 floors below, and every physician in Silvercrest Medical Center was out of answers. Emma Lawson stood in the parking lot with her badge in her hand and her career in pieces. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't begged. She'd told Dr. Victor Sloan exactly what was killing that man upstairs, and he'd laughed at her, called her a liability. Had security walk her to the door like she was a threat to the building. What nobody in that hospital knew, what nobody had bothered to find out, was that Emma Lawson had spent 6 years keeping men alive in places that don't appear on any public map. And the man dying upstairs? She'd treated soldiers who looked exactly like him. She recognized the signs. She'd seen them before, in the dark, with nothing but a field kit and a radio that wouldn't connect. She turned back toward the entrance. If this story hits something in you, stay until the end. Like it, follow along, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started like most of Emma's mornings. Early, quiet, already behind. She arrived at Silvercrest Medical Center at 6:48 a.m., 14 minutes before her shift was supposed to begin, because she'd learned a long time ago that the ER didn't care about scheduled start times. It cared about what was in front of you. She changed into her scrubs in a locker room that always smelled faintly of antiseptic and old coffee, clipped her badge to her chest, and walked out onto the floor without stopping to check herself in the mirror. That habit had died somewhere around year 2 of military service, when she'd realized that vanity and combat medicine didn't share a schedule. Ashbrook, Oregon wasn't a city that asked a lot of questions. It was mid-sized, functional, the kind of place where people moved when they wanted to raise a family or disappear quietly. Silvercrest sat at its center like an anchor. 12 floors of glass and concrete, a level 2 trauma center, recently ranked 3rd in the state for emergency response times. The administration loved that ranking. They put it on pamphlets. Emma had been working the ER for 8 months. 8 months of 12-hour shifts, double backs, understaffed weekends, and a nursing staff that was stretched so thin it sometimes felt like gauze over a wound that needed stitches. She didn't complain about it. She'd worked in worse. She'd worked in places where the idea of a fully staffed shift was something people joked about in the dark because there was nothing else to do. What she hadn't learned to manage yet, what still caught her off guard in small, frustrating ways, was the particular kind of dismissal she encountered at Silvercrest. Not hostility, exactly. More like a low-grade condescension that lived in the air. In the way certain physicians asked for her assessment and then didn't wait for her to finish it. In the way her patient flags were questioned before they were read. In the way she'd catch nurses who'd been there longer, not more experienced, just longer, exchanging looks when she made a call that didn't line up with the standard protocol. She was good at her job. She knew she was good at her job. That knowledge existed quietly inside her, not as arrogance, but as something more settled, a certainty that had been tested in conditions that Silvercrest's peer review board couldn't imagine. She just didn't talk about it. That was the thing. She'd never talked about it, and now she was starting to understand that silence had a cost. The ER that morning was manageable, then suddenly wasn't. That was always how it went. A car accident on the interstate came in at 7:30. 2 patients, one stable, one with a head laceration that looked worse than it was, a 40-year-old with chest pressure who turned out to be having a panic attack, a kid who'd broken 2 fingers at soccer practice. Emma moved through the cases with the steady, unhurried efficiency that made her effective and also, she suspected, made certain people nervous. There was something that read as arrogance in a nurse who didn't visibly struggle, even when she wasn't struggling. She was restocking a cart near Bay 4 when she first noticed the man in Bay 7. He'd been brought in around 8:15, logged as a walk-in with dizziness and possible syncope, which meant someone had fainted or come close to it. 62 years old, according to the intake form she glimpsed when she passed the station. Well-built, still muscular in the way of someone who'd kept up with themselves their whole life. Not for looks, but for function. He was sitting partially upright with his eyes open, but something about the quality of his stillness made her slow down. She'd seen that kind of stillness before. She stepped into the bay. The attending, a second-year resident named Dr. Philip Vance, who was technically covering the ER this morning while the senior staff handled a meeting, Had already done a quick once-over and written it up as dehydration with possible orthostatic hypotension. The IV was in. The fluids were running. Dr. Vance had moved on. Emma introduced herself and checked his vitals from the monitor. Heart rate 52, which was low but not critical. Blood pressure sitting at 88 over 56, which was lower than she'd like. She looked at his pupils. She asked him to follow her finger. He tracked, but slowly. Not the slow of a man who was tired. The slow of something interfering with the signal. "Sir, have you taken anything today? Any medication, supplements?" "Nothing." His voice was rough, deliberate. "I had coffee this morning." "Any new exposures recently? Travel? Environments you don't usually work in?" He looked at her for a moment. There was intelligence behind his eyes, clouded but present. "Why does that matter?" "I'm just trying to get a full picture," she said, keeping her tone neutral, not clinical. "You were traveling." "I landed at PDX last night, came in from overseas." She wrote that down on the secondary intake form. She checked his forearms for track marks out of habit, then stopped on something else. A faint, almost invisible tremor in his right hand. Fine, rhythmic, just barely perceptible. She watched it for 4 seconds. She went to find Dr. Vance. She found him at the nurse's station scrolling through labs for a different patient. "The gentleman in Bay 7, she said. "I think we need to run a broader tox panel. He's got a very subtle tremor in his right hand, and his pupillary response is slower than I'd expect from dehydration alone. He was overseas recently." Dr. Vance glanced up. He was 28, tired in the specific way of a resident in month 10, and he didn't dislike Emma exactly, but he also wasn't accustomed to nurses redirecting his assessments. "I saw him. Vitals are stable. He's responding to fluids. His pressure is 88 over 56. It'll come up. He was dehydrated." "The tremor?" "Emma." He said her name in a way that closed the conversation. "I've got 6 other patients. Let the fluids run and check back in 30. She stood there for a second, then nodded and went back to her cart. She wasn't angry. She was running a calculation. She checked on him again at 8:47. The tremor was worse. His heart rate had dropped to 46. He was responding to questions, but his sentences were getting shorter, like the effort of full ones was beginning to cost something. She went to the charge nurse, a woman named Darlene, who'd been at Silvercrest for 19 years, and who had a deep instinctive pragmatism that Emma respected. "That guy in Bay 7, Emma said quietly. "Something's wrong." Darlene looked over. Vance saw him. "I know. I'm asking you to look again." Darlene walked over with her, checked his pressure herself, 84 over 50 now, and frowned. "I'll put in for a repeat EKG and flag Vance again." "Can we get a toxicology attending?" "There isn't one on until 11. That was the part that sat wrong in Emma's chest as she walked back into the hall. Not the incompetence. Vance wasn't incompetent. He was overextended and working within the assumptions a normal ER carried. The problem was that this wasn't a normal presentation, and nobody here had a frame of reference for what it was. She did. She knew what it looked like. She knew because she had been in a tent in a place she couldn't name, with 3 soldiers presenting almost exactly like this man, and she'd spent 4 hours keeping them alive while a toxicologist half a world away talked her through the protocol over a satellite phone that kept cutting out. She knew the specific pattern of descending bradycardia and the way the tremor moved from distal to proximal. She knew what came next if they didn't intervene. What came next was a crash that the standard crash protocol wouldn't fix. At 9:02, she made the decision to escalate past Vance. This was the moment, she would think later, where it had all started. She asked the unit clerk to page Dr. Victor Sloan. She didn't do it lightly. Everyone who worked at Silvercrest understood something about Victor Sloan without needing it explained. He was 56, chief of surgery for 4 years, the kind of physician whose reputation preceded him like a weather system. He'd published. He'd trained residents who'd gone on to publish. He had the low patient contempt of a man who had been right enough times that he'd stopped entertaining the possibility of being wrong. He didn't like being paged for consults. He especially didn't like being paged from the ER. But Emma had seen the man in Bay 7's hands, and she couldn't unsee them. Sloan appeared on the floor at 9:11. He was in surgical scrubs, already gloved from something he'd been pulled away from, and his mood arrived before he did. "Who paged me?" Emma stepped forward. I did. I'm Emma Lawson, charge nurse. You're not charge nurse. Darlene is. I'm the one who flagged the patient. He looked at her with the flat appraisal of someone deciding how much of their time this would cost. Which patient? She walked him to bay 7 and laid it out. The progressive bradycardia, the distal tremor, the pupillary delay, the overseas travel, the fact that fluids hadn't moved the pressure. She kept it precise. She didn't editorialize. Sloan listened with his arms crossed. He checked the monitor. He looked at the patient, who was now resting with his eyes half closed in a way that didn't look like sleep. He pulled out his pen light and checked the pupils himself. Then he turned to her. He's hypotensive from dehydration. The bradycardia is within acceptable range. The tremor is, he glanced back, not visible right now. It was present 20 minutes ago. It'll return. Nurse Lawson. He said it with the careful patience of someone who has decided to be generous against their instincts. I appreciate that you're doing your job, but you're flagging a 62-year-old man who came in dizzy after an international flight and is currently responding to IV fluids. Do you know what the most common cause of that presentation is? I know what the most common cause is, she said. I also know what a less common cause looks like, and I'm telling you, I've seen it. Where? She paused. Less than a second, but he caught it. In clinical practice, she said. He uncrossed his arms. Something shifted in his expression that wasn't anger yet, but was adjacent to it. You're a nurse. You don't have clinical experience with battlefield toxicology? No, you're right. She said it plainly. But I've seen this presentation. The tremor pattern is specific. If I'm wrong, a broader tox panel costs us 40 minutes. If I'm right and we don't run it, we're going to lose him. Sloan stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Darlene, who had appeared in the doorway. Who is she? Emma Lawson, Darlene said carefully. She's been here 8 months. She's good. Has she given you problems before? Darlene's expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible. No. Fine. Sloan turned back to Emma. His voice dropped to something quiet and flat, which was actually worse than loud. I am the chief of surgery at this hospital. I have 30 years of clinical experience, and I have just personally assessed this patient. You're a floor nurse. You've been here 8 months. I don't know where you came from or what you think you saw somewhere, but I'm telling you right now, this man has dehydration and orthostatic hypotension. Continue IV fluids. If his pressure doesn't respond in 1 hour, we reevaluate. 1 hour. And I'm going to suggest you think very carefully about your position here before you continue arguing with me in front of my staff. The room was quiet. Emma looked at him. She looked at Darlene. She looked at the patient in bay 7, whose chest was rising and falling in a way that seemed slower than before. Dr. Sloan, she said, you're making a fatal mistake. The words came out steady. No dramatics. Just the statement of a thing she believed to be true. She watched him decide what she was. He turned to the unit clerk. Call the nursing supervisor. I want this nurse removed from the floor for insubordination. He looked back at Emma. You're done here. Victor? Darlene started. Darlene, please don't. Emma stood still for a moment. Then she removed her badge from her chest with a quiet click. She set it on the counter. Okay, she said. Not because she agreed, because the math had just changed, and she was already thinking about what she could still do. She walked to the locker room. She changed out of her scrubs with the methodical calm of someone who has had to hold it together in much worse circumstances. She folded them, set them on the bench, and put her own clothes back on. The nursing supervisor met her in the hallway. Her name was Janet Pruitt, and she looked uncomfortable in the way people look when they've been handed a task they didn't choose. She gave Emma the official separation language in the careful tone HR documents required. Emma listened. She signed what she needed to sign. Janet pressed a sympathy she couldn't quite locate into her expression and said, I'm sure you understand it's a matter of the patient environment. Sure, Emma said. She walked to the elevator. She walked through the lobby. She pushed through the main doors of Silvercrest Medical Center and stepped into the cool Oregon morning and stood in the parking lot with her jacket under her arm. 9:14 a.m. She stood there for about 30 seconds. The parking lot was half full, concrete gray under an overcast sky. The kind of day that felt like it was waiting to decide what kind of day it would become. Then she took her phone out. She scrolled to a number that wasn't labeled. No name in the contact, just a 10-digit string she'd memorized before saving it because some habit stayed. She pressed call. It rang twice. Lawson? The voice on the other end was flat, professional, and very awake. I need to report a possible contamination incident involving an active military personnel, she said. Silvercrest Medical Center, Ashbrook, Oregon, 62-year-old male, descending bradycardia, distal tremor, pupillary delay, recent overseas travel. I flagged it. Hospital dismissed me. I was removed from the floor. A silence, then, rank and ID. E7, retired. Emma Lawson, service number Hotel Sierra, 4477. Romeo. She said the string without hesitating. I'm standing in the parking lot right now. Another silence. She could hear the click of something being entered on the other end. We have a general listed as arriving at that hospital this morning. Hale, Marcus, 4 stars. Emma closed her eyes once. When she opened them, she was already walking back toward the entrance. That's him, she said. How long do I have? If your presentation is accurate, 60 to 90 minutes before cardiac involvement. They're not treating it. No, the voice said, and it wasn't an agreement, it was an assessment. They're not. She heard 3 things at the same time. The voice on the phone saying, we're mobilizing, a sound in the distance that she recognized before she could name it, the low mechanical percussion of heavy vehicles moving at coordinated speed, and the sound of her own footsteps accelerating on the pavement. She was through the doors before anyone at the nurses' station had time to register she'd come back. Bay 7 was straight ahead. General Marcus Hale was seizing. It wasn't dramatic. It rarely was with neurotoxin involvement. No grand convulsion, no noise. It was the absence of movement where there should have been movement, and then the monitor screaming what his body wasn't. His heart rate had dropped to 32. His blood pressure had bottomed out. Dr. Vance was already there, calling for the crash cart, looking at the numbers on the monitor with the frozen expression of someone who had just run off the edge of their training. Emma put her bag down on the counter. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She walked straight to the bed and said, I need atropine, 1 milligram IV push. And someone paged the attending. Not for cardiac. For toxicology. Tell them it's a battlefield neurotoxin exposure. Tell them to look up Protocol Delta 7. Vance turned. You were removed. I know. Atropine now. The tech at the cart looked between them. Emma held Vance's eyes. Dr. Vance, she said quietly. His heart is at 32. You can ask me to leave again in 5 minutes. Right now I need you to make a choice. It wasn't a long pause. 2 seconds, maybe 3, but it felt like something cracking open. Get her the atropine, Vance said. Emma had her gloves on before the words finished. The crash cart rattled. Monitors shrieked. Somewhere in the distance through the building's exterior walls came a sound that the other staff were only now beginning to register. The low, rhythmic rumble of vehicles that didn't belong in a hospital parking lot, getting louder, then louder than that, until the windows in the bay began to vibrate. Emma wasn't listening to any of it. She was watching the drip, watching the monitor, watching the minute adjustments that told her whether the intervention was landing. The heart rate ticked to 35, then 38. That's it, she said to herself. Come on. The doors of the ER burst open. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the coordinated efficiency of people who had trained to move through space fast and without apology. 8 of them, in tactical gear, rifles down but present, faces hard in the particular way of soldiers who have been given a task and intend to complete it. A woman in a gray suit walked at the front of the second cluster, moving fast on flat shoes, a phone already at her ear. The entire ER went still. The woman in the gray suit looked at the nurses' station and said, 3 words, no preamble. Where is Lawson? Darlene was already pointing. The soldiers moved. Emma didn't look up. They were moving fast, but Emma was faster in the way that mattered. She was already inside the problem, and they were still navigating the building. The soldier who reached the doorway first stopped short when he saw her. Gloved hands on the patient, eyes on the monitor, speaking in a low, continuous tone to Vance about the drip rate. Not panicking, not performing, just working. The woman in the gray suit stepped past him into the bay. "Lawson." "1 minute," Emma said. The woman blinked. She wasn't accustomed to that answer. She waited anyway. The monitor climbed. 41, 44, 47. Emma adjusted the drip by a fraction, watched 2 full cycles on the monitor, then straightened and stripped one glove from her right hand. She turned. "Special Agent Carver," the woman said, and held up a credential that Emma didn't need to read closely. "Federal insignia, defense adjacent. I understand you made a call about 40 minutes ago." 43 minutes? Emma said. "His rate was at 32 when I walked back in. It's at 47 now. He needs a toxicology attending with Delta 7 clearance, and he needs a controlled environment. This bay isn't adequate. You've got open corridor exposure and civilian staff who don't have context for what they're looking at." Carver was already nodding before Emma finished. She turned and spoke 2 sentences to the soldier in the doorway, and the response was immediate. The team reorganized with the efficient silence of people who'd rehearsed for scenarios that never quite matched this but were close enough. Vance hadn't moved from his position near the crash cart. He was watching all of it with the expression of someone whose understanding of his own morning had just been fundamentally revised. "What is Delta 7? He asked. Nobody answered him. That was the moment. Not the soldiers, not the federal agent, not the military convoy still visible through the bay window in the parking lot. That moment was when Dr. Philip Vance understood that something had happened in this ER that his training had not prepared him for. He looked at Emma, who was pulling her second glove off and dropping both into the waste bin with the flat efficiency of someone moving to the next task. "Vance," she said, quieter now, not unkind. "You made the right call. The atropine bought us time. That matters." He nodded, but the nod was automatic. He was still processing. Down the hall, the situation was less calm. Victor Sloan had been informed of the military presence in the ER approximately 6 minutes after the convoy arrived, and his response had been to come to the floor himself. Not because he was alarmed initially, but because his instinct when institutional authority was challenged was to present himself as the institutional authority. He arrived in the hallway outside Bay 7 at 9:48 a.m. with the expression of a man preparing to correct a misunderstanding. He saw the soldiers first, then Carver, then Emma Lawson standing inside the bay with her civilian clothes and no badge, speaking with the federal agent in a tone that was not consistent with the posture of someone who had been removed from the premises 34 minutes ago. "What the hell is going on?" He didn't shout. He was too controlled for that. But the words came out hard. Carver turned. She assessed him in about a second and a half. "Dr. Sloan, Chief of Surgery?" "That's correct. And I'd like to know who authorized this woman to re-enter." "I did," Carver said. "And that authorization supersedes your employment action. She's here in a federal capacity." The word federal landed differently than Sloan had expected. He recalibrated. "What federal capacity?" "She's a floor nurse. She's a retired E7 combat medic with specialized toxicology training, and she correctly identified a classified exposure agent in a patient your team was treating for dehydration." Carver's voice was even, not combative, the tone of someone reciting facts. "The patient is General Marcus Hale, 4-star, commander of Special Operations Task Force Iron Gate. And right now, his heart rate is stabilizing because Nurse Lawson walked back into this hospital after you removed her and administered the correct intervention." Sloan didn't move. Something crossed his face. Not guilt. Not yet, because guilt requires admission, and he wasn't there. But the first hairline crack in his certainty. He looked past Carver into the bay, at the general, at the monitor, at Emma, who was not looking at him. She was watching the monitor. "You can't. She's not credentialed to—" "Dr. Sloan." Carver didn't raise her voice. "I'd strongly suggest you stop talking right now and let me do my job." He stopped talking. It was the kind of silence that doesn't end. It just waits for the next thing to break it. What broke it was a second team arriving from the stairwell, these ones in plain clothes with lanyards that were a specific shade of blue Emma recognized from another life. Military intelligence attachés. Not special operations, something quieter and more dangerous. Two of them went directly to the nursing station and asked for patient records going back to Hale's arrival. One of them unfolded a laptop and started working before he'd fully sat down. Emma watched all of it from the doorway of Bay 7 without moving into it or away from it. Carver came back to her. "We need you in a secondary briefing room in approximately 20 minutes, Carver said. "But until then, I need you in there." She gestured toward the general. "Our field medic is still 10 minutes out. You're what we have. I need a full metabolic panel, a repeat tox screen, and I need someone to tell me what compounds he's been around in the last 72 hours. Country of origin, facility type, anything." "That's classified." "I know it's classified," Emma said. "I have a Delta clearance. Check it." Carver pulled her phone out. She made a short call, listened, and looked at Emma with the specific expression of someone recalibrating. "We'll get you the information," she said. Emma went back to the general. He was conscious now, barely, but present. His eyes tracked her when she moved into his field of vision, which was a meaningful improvement from the half-glassed stillness of 30 minutes ago. She checked his pupils again. Still slow, but the asymmetry was reducing. "Sir," she said, "can you hear me?" "Yes." His voice was rough, abraded, like something that had been dragged across gravel. "Who are you?" "Emma Lawson. I'm a nurse, former combat medic, 7th Medical Support Battalion." He looked at her for a moment. "They called you in?" "I was already here." She checked his wrist pulse against the monitor reading, a habit. "You're going to be okay. The compound is responding to the atropine, and we're going to get a toxicologist in here within the hour to manage the clearance protocol." "What compound?" "I don't know the exact designation yet, but I know the symptom ladder. I've seen it." He studied her. There was something behind his eyes that was starting to come back. The focused, evaluating quality of a man who was used to reading situations fast. "Where?" She didn't answer that. Not because she was hiding it, but because the protocol of the silence around her service was so ingrained that deflection was automatic, even now. He didn't push it. He'd been in rooms with people who had that kind of deflection before. He understood what it meant. "Rest," she said. "I'll be right here." In the hallway, things were escalating. The hospital administration had been notified at 9:52 a.m. that Silvercrest Medical Center was now operating under a partial federal security protocol, which meant certain areas of the ER were restricted, certain patient records were being accessed by federal agents, and the chief of surgery had been asked to remain available for questioning in connection with a federal health security matter. The language in the official notification was careful, but the administrator who read it, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had worked in hospital administration for 22 years, went pale in a way his assistant had never seen him go pale before. Sloan was in his office by 10:05. He'd been asked, not ordered, to stay there, but the asking had been done by someone in a blue lanyard with a specific quality of stillness that made the distinction feel academic. He sat behind his desk and looked at the wall of credentials and awards above his credenza, and thought about what had just happened in a way that his brain kept flinching away from. He picked up his phone. He started to dial a number, then stopped. Put the phone face down on the desk. He was not a stupid man. He'd built a career on being not stupid, on reading rooms, on understanding which way a situation was moving before it moved, and this situation was moving in a direction he had never anticipated and was not prepared for. He sat very still for a long time. Back in the ER, Emma had a second problem she hadn't mentioned to Carver yet. The metabolic panel results had come back, and they were telling her something that the atropine intervention was partially masking. The neurotoxin, she still didn't have an official compound identification, but the symptom pattern was distinctive enough that she'd been privately labeling it in her head as an organophosphate variant, one of the newer generation compounds that the classified toxicology briefings from her last deployment had described as theoretically possible. The compound appeared to have a secondary agent in it, something that modified the absorption curve. She'd seen that once before, in a briefing document she'd read in a secured facility in a city she was contractually prohibited from naming, and the implication of it was that the atropine alone wasn't going to be enough. It was buying time, which was what she'd said it would do. But the clearance was going to require a specific chelation sequence that she didn't have the equipment for in this bay. She needed the OR. She needed equipment that wasn't standard. And she needed a physician with the credentials to authorize the procedure. She went to find Carver. "How long until your field medic?" she asked. Carver checked her phone. 7 minutes. "I need more than a field medic. I need a physician who's been briefed on modified organophosphate compounds and has the authority to authorize chelation in a surgical environment. I need the OR prepped, and I need it in the next 20 minutes because the atropine is going to plateau, and when it does, the secondary agent is going to start the cascade again." Carver looked at her for exactly 1 second. "Okay," she said, and went back to her phone. It was the kind of okay that meant, "I believe you and I am acting on it," which was something Emma had not heard from anyone in this building all morning, and the relief of it was more physical than she expected. A slight, involuntary release in her shoulders that she noticed and consciously walked back. This was not over. She didn't have time to feel relieved. The military toxicologist arrived at 10:17, not the field medic Carver had originally referenced, but a colonel named Dr. Iris Tambor, who'd apparently been flown in from a regional base that Emma hadn't known was operating within distance of Ashbrook. She was compact, direct, gray at the temples, and she walked into Bay 7 and looked at the chart Emma handed her without looking at Emma first. Then she looked up. "You ran the atropine protocol from presentation?" "From suspected presentation," Emma said. "I didn't have a confirmed ID. But you suspected Delta 7 pathology." The tremor pattern was specific, and he'd had overseas exposure. Tambor looked back at the chart, then at the monitor. "Modified compound. You caught the secondary agent? It's in the metabolic panel. The bilirubin elevation is atypical for standard exposure." Tambor set the chart down. She looked at Emma in a way that wasn't quite assessment and wasn't quite recognition, something in between. "What unit were you in?" 7th Medical Support attached to JSOC. Something shifted in Tambor's expression. She didn't say anything about it. She turned and started speaking to Carver about OR access, and Emma stepped back and let the handoff happen. This was the part she'd always been good at, not the credit, but the transition. Knowing when the task required her and when it didn't. She'd spent years in roles where her job was to be effective and invisible, and she'd gotten very good at knowing which one the moment called for. She stood near the bay entrance while Tambor took over the primary, and the team reorganized around the new authority, and she felt the specific hollowness of someone who has just carried something very heavy and set it down. The general was going to make it. She knew that now. His vitals were holding, Tambor knew what she was looking at, and the OR prep was already underway on the 3rd floor. But something else was happening in the building that Emma didn't know about yet. The intelligence attachés who'd set up at the nurses' station had been working for 40 minutes on the patient records and the hospital's entry logs, and at 10:23 they found something. They didn't announce it. One of them picked up a secure phone and had a 2-minute conversation in a low voice. And then he folded the laptop and carried it to Carver and said 3 words that were quiet enough that Emma couldn't hear them from where she was standing. But she could see Carver's face. She watched something move through the federal agent's expression that wasn't surprise exactly. It was the look of someone who had suspected and just been confirmed. It was a cold look. Professional. The kind you develop when your job is finding out what people don't want found. Carver looked up and found Sloane's office number on the wall directory. She walked toward the elevator. In his office on the 4th floor, Victor Sloane heard the knock at 10:26 and said, "Come in," and when he saw who was standing in his doorway, Carver, and behind her, one of the intelligence attachés, and behind him a man in a federal law enforcement jacket, he understood before any words were spoken that the direction of the morning had just permanently changed. "Dr. Sloane," Carver said, "we have some questions about your relationship with Northgate Defense Solutions." The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Sloane's face did something complicated and brief, and then it settled into careful neutrality, but it was too late. Carver had been watching for exactly that reaction. "I'm not familiar," he started. "We have 11 months of communications," the attaché behind her said. He didn't look up from his phone when he said it. "Financial transfers. and hospital records showing altered admission protocols for 3 patients in the last 8 months who all fit a specific demographic. 3 patients. Emma didn't know this yet. She was still on the ground floor, standing near Bay 7, watching the monitor that showed a general's heart rate climbing steadily back toward a number that meant he would live. She didn't know that 30 feet from where she'd administered that first dose of atropine, there were records that 3 other people had come through this ER with similar presentations. That 2 of them had not been treated with the urgency their presentations required. That 1 of them had died 6 weeks ago, listed as cardiac arrest of undetermined origin. She didn't know that Sloane's name appeared in every file. She didn't know any of it yet. What she knew, standing in the hallway of the hospital that had fired her 4 hours ago, was that her phone was buzzing in her jacket pocket. She took it out. The number on the screen was one she recognized. Not the string she'd called that morning, but a different one, stored the same way. No label, just digits. She answered. Lawson. A different voice this time, lower. Someone she hadn't spoken to in 3 years. We need you to stay in that building. She looked down the hall. She looked at the elevator where Carver had just disappeared. What did they find? She asked. A pause. Shorter than the ones from the morning. This one had a different quality. Not hesitation, but wait. Emma, the voice said, and the use of her first name was its own kind of information. This isn't just about the general. She ended the call without saying goodbye, which was how calls like that always ended, and stood in the alcove for exactly 4 seconds before she started moving. The problem with hospitals at 2 in the morning was that they were quiet enough to hear things, but busy enough that those things got absorbed into the general noise of the place without anyone stopping to examine them. A door opening that shouldn't open. Footsteps in a corridor where footsteps didn't usually go. Someone in a maintenance uniform who moved with the wrong kind of purpose. These were things that a trained observer noticed and that everyone else processed as background, filed under probably nothing, and forgot. Claire had spent 4 years learning that probably nothing was the most dangerous category. She took the long route back to the nursing station, past the service elevator, past the east stairwell, past the corridor that connected the ER to the hospital's main building, and she looked at everything. She wasn't performing a security sweep. Not exactly. She was doing what she'd always done, which was observe, categorize, flag. The difference now was that the flags meant something different than they had 6 hours ago. Delia was still at the nursing station. The board had thinned. 3 active patients remaining, the appendicitis woman waiting on her CT results, a teenager with a lacerated forearm who was going to need another 2 hours before she was stable enough to discharge, and a 60-year-old man with a hypertensive episode that was resolving slower than they'd like. You look like you swallowed something wrong, Delia said, without looking up from her charting. I'm fine. You look like you looked in Kabul. Delia paused, then set her pen down. I'm not supposed to know about that. No, Claire said, you're not. Your file was open on the supervisor's computer 18 months ago. I wasn't snooping, it was just open. Claire looked at her. Delia had the particular expression of someone who had been holding a piece of information for a long time and had finally found the right moment to put it down. Not confrontational, just honest. How much did you see? Enough to understand tonight better than Dr. Voss does. She picked her pen back up. I don't need you to confirm anything. I just want you to know that if you need a second set of eyes on something, I've got 11 more hours on this shift. Claire stood there for a moment. It wasn't a comfortable moment. She didn't particularly like being known, even partially, even by someone she trusted, but Delia was offering something real, and this was not a night to refuse real things on principle. The maintenance corridor on sublevel 2, Claire said, quietly. Does anyone from our department go down there? Delia frowned. Not unless there's an HVAC issue. Why? Probably nothing. Delia's eyes said she understood exactly what probably nothing meant. I'll make a note. Claire went to check on her patients, and while she was checking on her patients, she was also tracking the activity on the floor. Who came and went, which doors opened, what the security camera angles covered, and what they didn't. Ironcrest had a reasonable security setup for a civilian hospital, which was to say it had cameras in the lobbies, the main corridors, the ER bay, and the parking structures, and it had gaps in the sub-level maintenance areas and in the east stairwell above the third floor, and in approximately 40% of the auxiliary corridors that had been built during the 1987 expansion and never fully retrofitted. She knew this because she'd been bored during a night shift 8 months ago and had looked at the building schematics out of habit. Old habits, the kind that turned out to matter. At 2:48 in the morning, Holloway found her in the medication room. He didn't knock. The door wasn't the kind that knocked. It was a push-bar entry. But he stopped in the doorway with the particular posture of someone who was giving her the option to tell him to leave. She didn't tell him to leave. She finished logging the medication she was pulling and said, "Sublevel 2. Do your people have eyes on it?" He was quiet for half a second in a way that told her they didn't. "We're concentrated on the OR floor and the ICU. You need someone on sublevel 2. Why?" "Because the ballistics estimate puts the firing position close to this building, and there's exactly one angle from this building that gives you a clean shot at the Route 7 overpass corridor. And that angle is from the southeast corner of the sublevel 2 maintenance shaft." He looked at her. "You calculated that in the last hour." "I calculated it in the last 20 minutes. He pulled out his radio. She went back to her patients. The OR called down at 3:15. General Rains was out of surgery. The vascular repair had held. He was being moved to a secured ICU suite on the 6th floor, the suite that the hospital used for high-profile patients, the one with the single corridor access point that Holloway's team had spent the last 2 hours checking, rechecking, and configuring to their satisfaction. He was sedated. He would remain sedated for at least another 8 hours. His prognosis, the surgical attending told the charge nurse, was cautiously optimistic. Cautiously optimistic. Claire had heard that phrase in field hospitals, and she knew what it actually meant, which was, we did what we could, and now we wait and try not to think too hard about what could still go wrong. She finished her shift at 6 a.m. and did not go home. This was a decision she made in the parking structure while sitting in her car with the engine off, watching the morning light hit the glass facade of Ironcrest at an angle that made it look, briefly, like it was made of something other than what it was. She had an apartment 12 minutes away. She had a bed, clean sheets, a cat named something embarrassing that she'd named during a particularly bad insomnia stretch and had never bothered to rename. She had the ordinary infrastructure of a civilian life that she'd spent 2 years building and maintaining. She went back inside. She changed into street clothes in the staff locker room and got coffee from the third-floor vending machine and found a chair in the family waiting area near the east stairwell where she had a sight line to the main corridor and the elevator bank and the door to the stairwell itself. She had a paperback in her bag. She opened it to a random page and did not read it. At 7:20 a.m., she saw Dr. Voss arrive. This was not unusual. Voss kept early hours, another quality he managed to work into conversation when possible. But the person he was talking to was. The man was 50s, dressed expensively without looking like he was trying to, with the kind of face that was easy to pass over and the kind of posture that suggested he'd spent years cultivating that quality. They were walking close, speaking low. Voss had his hands in his coat pockets, which was what he did when he was nervous about something, and the other man was not doing anything that looked like nervousness, which sometimes meant the opposite. Claire watched them walk past the waiting area. Neither of them looked at her. She was a woman in street clothes with a coffee cup and a paperback in a hospital waiting room at 7 in the morning, which was not something that warranted attention. She noted the time. She noted the direction they walked. She noted the other man's face. At 8:02 a.m., she was in Dr. Patricia Eng's office. It was a corner office. Real wood desk, not the laminate that the department heads got. Certificates on the walls and the arrangement that said, "I earned these," rather than "I am decorating with these." And Ung was behind it with a cup of tea that was probably her third of the morning and the expression of someone who had thought carefully about what they wanted to say and had then thought about it again. "Sit down, Bennett." Claire sat. "I've reviewed the trauma room documentation from last night. I've spoken with the OR team." Ung wrapped both hands around her tea. "The procedure you performed, the vascular compression technique, is not in our standard trauma protocols." "No." "It's not something that's taught in nursing school." "No." Ung looked at her. "Where did you learn it?" There was a version of this conversation in which Claire said, "I can't discuss that," and a version in which she gave a partial answer that was technically true, and a version in which she gave the full answer. She ran through the implications of each in the time it took to set her tea down and wait. "I served as a combat medic," Claire said. "Army. 4 years. Part of that service involved advanced trauma training in environments where surgical support wasn't available." Was quiet for a moment. "That's not in your application file." "I didn't include it." "Why not?" It was a reasonable question. Claire had an answer. She'd had an answer ready for 2 years, a clean, simple one about wanting a fresh start, which was true as far as it went. But sitting in this office at 8 a.m. after the night she'd had, the clean, simple answer felt inadequate in a way she didn't want to examine. "Because I didn't want it to define me here," she said instead. "I wanted to be a nurse. I didn't want to be the nurse with the military background." Considered that. "And last night?" "Last night there wasn't time for the distinction." Something in Ng's face shifted. Not softened exactly, but changed. She picked up her tea again. "Dr. Voss has submitted a formal complaint. Unauthorized medical procedure, no surgical privileges, potential patient endangerment." She said it neutrally, reporting rather than editorializing. "He's requesting that you be suspended pending a full clinical review." Claire had been expecting this. "And what are you requesting?" "I haven't decided yet." Met her eyes. "The general is alive. The surgical team told me the vascular compression bought them the margin they needed. Without it—" She stopped. "The patient is alive, Bennett. That's not nothing." "No," Claire agreed. "It's not." "There are also," said more slowly, "some other considerations that have come to my attention this morning, from sources I am not at liberty to discuss." She paused in a way that felt deliberate. "I've been asked to ensure that you are available for the next several days." Claire looked at her. "I don't know what that means," said. "I'm choosing not to ask what it means, but I'm telling you so that you understand the situation. The complaint is being reviewed," which meant it was being set aside, for now, under pressure from a direction wasn't naming. "You're not suspended. You're on administrative reassignment to the 6th floor for the duration of the current situation." The 6th floor. The secured ICU suite. She'd been assigned to guard him. Nobody was going to say that out loud, but that was what had just happened. Holloway had made a call. Someone had made a call above Holloway, and the machinery had moved. "I'll need to go home first," Claire said. "Change." "Of course." Stood, which was the signal that the meeting was concluded. "Bennett." She waited until Claire was at the door. "I don't know your full record. I suspect it's more substantial than a nursing application would suggest. What I do know is that you kept a man alive last night when the people who were supposed to be keeping him alive were struggling." She said it carefully, giving Voss only the latitude his position technically required. "That matters here. Whatever else is happening, that matters." Claire nodded and left. She was in the elevator going down when her phone buzzed. A text from a number she'd put in her contacts as a single letter after Holloway had given it to her at 3 a.m. Sublevel 2. "We found something." She pressed the button for B2. The sublevel maintenance corridor smelled like it always did. Concrete and recycled air and the faint chemical undertone of industrial cleaning products. The fluorescent lighting was the unflattering kind that no architect had ever chosen intentionally. She counted 8 of Holloway's people before she saw Holloway himself, and what they were clustered around was a support pillar in the southeast corner of the maintenance shaft, which was exactly where she'd told him to look. "Firing position," Holloway said when she reached him. Not a question. "Someone set up here. The mount marks are in the concrete. Tripod, fixed position. There's brass." He indicated a small numbered marker on the floor. 9.3 times 64, long range, precision. "How long had it been here?" "Residue suggests between 6 and 18 hours. We're narrowing it." "Which means it was set up before the ceremony, before Rains arrived in Ashridge." "Correct." She looked at the angle. From this position, through the maintenance shaft grating, there was a narrow but viable sightline to the Route 7 overpass corridor. The shooter would have needed the vehicle to be in the exact right position for less than 4 seconds. That required either extraordinary luck or specific route intelligence communicated with enough precision to predict exactly where the vehicle would be. "Access to this corridor," she said. "How?" Holloway pointed to the keypad on the maintenance door. "Electronic entry. The log shows it was accessed 3 times in the last 72 hours, twice by registered maintenance staff, once by—" He checked his tablet. "A code assigned to hospital administration, executive level." She absorbed that. "Do you have the name?" "The code is registered to the office of the chief of surgery." Holloway looked at her. "Dr. Harlan Voss." The noise of the maintenance corridor filled the space where speech would have been. The hum of the HVAC system. Dr. Harlan Voss. The noise of the maintenance corridor filled the space where speech would have been. The hum of the HVAC system. The distant clank of something mechanical. The low voices of Holloway's team at the far end of the shaft. She stood with that information and let it settle into the architecture of everything else she knew about last night. Voss, who had pulled her away from the patient, who had put his hands on her and said, "Stay out of this," who had stood in the corridor at midnight and announced loudly enough to Carrie that she had endangered a patient, who had filed a formal complaint with Human Resources before the blood had dried, who had, 3 days ago, used an executive access code to enter the maintenance corridor that contained the firing position for the assassination attempt on General Frederick Raines. "This doesn't make him the shooter," she said. Carefully, because careful still mattered. "No," Holloway agreed, "but it makes him something. The man he was walking with this morning, 50s, expensive coat, moves like he wants people to look past him." She described the face as precisely as she could. "Can you run that?" Holloway was already writing. "You saw them together this morning?" 7:20 a.m. main corridor, walking toward the east wing. He nodded. He didn't say "good work" or "that's useful" or any of the things that a civilian might have said. He just wrote it down and moved on, which was the language she'd grown up in, the language of people who understood that the time you spent on acknowledgement was time you weren't spending on the problem. She left the sublevel and went home to change, because she was going to need clean clothes and she was not going to get another opportunity for a while. She fed the cat, named Cartridge. She'd been in a particular mood, and she stood in her kitchen for 4 minutes drinking water and looking at the ordinary objects of her apartment: the coffee maker, the stack of unread mail on the counter, the running shoes by the door that she used 3 mornings a week when the world felt like something she could outrun. Then she went back. The 6th floor looked different in daylight. Still clinical, still the subdued lighting and the monitoring equipment and the smell of antiseptic, but with actual windows now showing an Ashridge morning, pale October sun, the mountains in the distance doing what they did, beautiful and indifferent. She got her assignment from the charge nurse and settled into the routine of the floor, which was slower and more deliberate than the ER, the kind of nursing that required patience rather than speed. She was checking vitals on the patient in room 604, not Raines, an elderly woman recovering from a stroke, when the overhead announcement system clicked on. It was a standard tone, the kind that preceded routine announcements. She'd heard it 100 times, but the words that followed were not routine. "Code Silver, 6th floor. Code Silver, 6th floor. All personnel respond per protocol." Code Silver. Active threat. Armed individual. She was already moving when the first gunshot echoed from the direction of the ICU suite. She stood very still in the hallway and let that sentence do what it needed to do. "This isn't just about the general." "Talk to me," she said. "Not on this line." The voice was measured in the way of someone who had learned to measure everything before they said it. "But I need you to understand, what's in that building is bigger than hail. The federal team is going to find it on their own in the next hour. Maybe 2. We need you there when they do. Not as a nurse, not as a civilian, as someone who can read what they're looking at and explain what it means." Emma turned slowly, putting her back to the wall, watching the ER floor in front of her. Darlene was at the station, speaking quietly to one of the intelligence attachés. 2 of the tactical team had repositioned near the exterior doors. Tambor's voice was audible from the direction of the OR prep bay, running through equipment requirements with someone on the phone. Why me specifically? Emma asked. Because you were in country when the compound was first field tested. The hallway felt like it got smaller. She hadn't expected that. She'd suspected the compound, had recognized the symptom pattern, had carried the quiet certainty of someone who'd seen something classified and never spoken about it publicly. But she hadn't known it had made it here. She hadn't known it had left the region where she'd encountered it, hadn't known it was moving in this direction, toward civilian infrastructure, toward a hospital in Ashbrook, Oregon, of all places. Which deployment? She said. It wasn't really a question. You know which one? She did. Give me 20 minutes, she said and ended the call. She stood there for 3 more seconds with the phone in her hand, and then she put it away and walked toward the elevator because standing still in a hallway wasn't going to help anyone. The 4th floor felt different from the ER, quieter, in the fragile way of spaces where something is recently broken and people are still figuring out what the pieces are. 2 federal agents were positioned outside Sloane's office door. They weren't blocking it exactly, but their presence made the intention clear. Through the half-open door, she could hear Carver's voice, not loud, not aggressive, the measured cadence of someone asking questions that already have answers, and watching to see which lies get chosen. Emma didn't go to Sloane's office. She went to the records room. This was the thing about Silvercrest that she'd mapped in her first 2 months, before she'd learned to stop paying attention to exits and layouts and access points. The records room on the 4th floor had a secondary terminal that pulled from the same database as the nursing station below, but with broader administrative permissions. She knew this because she'd been sent up to retrieve a misfiled intake form in month 3, and she'd noticed the permission tier on the terminal the way she noticed things, automatically, without deciding to. She badged in with her physical keycard, which apparently hadn't been deactivated yet. Maybe the termination hadn't propagated through every system. Maybe someone had more pressing things to process this morning. Either way, the door clicked open. She sat down at the terminal and pulled up the patient records for the 3 cases the attaché had referenced. She didn't know their names yet, but she could search by date range and presentation code, and she'd been in this system long enough to know which presentation codes clustered around cardiac events of uncertain origin. The first one, Raymond Ostroff, 68, admitted 7.5 months ago. Chief complaint, dizziness, chest pressure. Attending, Dr. Philip Vance. Disposition, admitted for observation, discharged after 36 hours. Outcome notation, resolved, assumed vasovagal episode. She looked at the secondary vitals logged during his admission. Heart rate pattern on arrival, descending. Tremor noted by admitting nurse and flagged, then crossed off the flag list with a notation. Reviewed by attending, not clinically significant. V. Sloane, MD, Sloane, not Vance. Sloane had reviewed and cleared the flag. She went to the next file, Patricia Morrow, 71, admitted 5 months ago. Similar presentation, longer admission. The tremor notation was absent from her file entirely, which was itself a notation. Emma had trained in documentation systems long enough to recognize the specific blankness of a field that should have something in it. There was a gap in the vitals log between 2 and 4 a.m. on her second night, during which her heart rate had apparently not been recorded. Then normal vitals resumed. She'd been discharged with a diagnosis of autonomic dysfunction, unspecified. She was alive. Emma checked the patient number against the outcome database. Alive, still listed as an active patient at the clinic associated with Silvercrest. The third file. Thomas Carradine, 59, admitted 6 weeks ago. Emma opened it and sat back in her chair. Cause of death? Cardiac arrest, undetermined etiology. Time of death? 3:17 a.m. 2 nurses had documented progressive bradycardia in the hours leading up to it. One of them had requested a cardiology consult at 1:45 a.m. The consult had been denied. Denied by V. Sloane, MD. She sat with that for a moment, not processing it emotionally. She didn't have room for that right now, but processing it the way she processed terrain, understanding the shape of it, the elevation changes, where it opened and where it closed. Sloane hadn't just missed something. He'd made active decisions. He'd reviewed flags and removed them. He'd denied consults. He'd put his name on interventions, or the absence of interventions, in a pattern that only looked like a pattern if you knew what the compound looked like and what it did. The question was whether he'd known what it was. If he had, what she was looking at wasn't negligence. It was something with a different name. She printed 3 pages, folded them, put them in her jacket pocket, and logged out of the terminal. In the hallway, one of the intelligence attachés was walking toward her with the expression of someone who had been looking for her but was trying not to look like it. Ms. Lawson. Young, mid-20s, the kind of tired that comes from 24-hour operational tempo. Agent Carver would like you in the briefing. Where? Conference room B, 3rd floor. She followed him to the elevator. On the way down, he didn't say anything, and she didn't push him. The elevator was the old kind, slow. And in the silence, she became aware that her hands were steady and her breathing was even, and she was very, very tired in a way she hadn't acknowledged until this moment. She'd been running on the specific adrenaline of crisis management, and the crisis wasn't over, but it had shifted, moved from acute to systemic. And her body was doing its own recalculation. Conference room B had been converted. The long table had a laptop at one end and a portable projector casting documents onto the wall. Carver was there, and Tambor, and 2 people Emma didn't recognize, a man in his 50s with a military bearing he wasn't trying to hide, and a woman in her 30s with a federal contractor lanyard that identified her as being from an office whose full name was abbreviated into something deliberately nondescript. Carver looked up when Emma came in. "Sit down," she said. "Not unkind, just efficient." Emma sat. She took the folded papers from her jacket pocket and put them on the table. Carver looked at them. "What's that?" "Ostroff Morrow, Carradine. Patient records. I pulled them from the 4th floor terminal before someone thought to revoke my system access." She slid them across the table. "Sloane's name is in all 3 files, not as the attending, as the override. He reviewed flagged vitals and cleared them. He denied a cardiology consult on Carradine at 1:45 a.m., 6 weeks before Carradine died. The woman with the nondescript lanyard picked up the papers without asking. She read them without expression. Carver looked at Emma for a moment. "How did you know to pull those specific files?" "I had a call," Emma said, "before I came up here. Someone told me this wasn't just about Hale. The room got the particular quality of a space in which everyone is recalculating who knows what and when they knew it." "Who called you?" the older man asked. "I don't know how to answer that without clearance context," Emma said. "Can you tell me who you are?" He held her gaze. "Deputy Director Waylon Marsh, Defense Intelligence." She looked at him for a moment. "Then you already know who called me." He didn't confirm it and didn't deny it. That was confirmation enough. Tambor leaned forward. "The compound is confirmed as a synthetic organophosphate variant, 2nd generation. The modification to the absorption curve is consistent with what we've been tracking out of a specific program connected to Northgate Defense Solutions. The general was exposed within the last 72 hours, most likely in a controlled environment, not field exposure. The dosing pattern is consistent with intent." The word intent settled into the room. "Someone poisoned him," Emma said. "Someone administered a compound to him in a quantity and delivery method that suggests knowledge of the compound's effects," Tambor said, which was the careful version of the same thing. Emma looked at Marsh. "And the 3 hospital patients?" "We believe they were earlier exposures," Marsh said. "Possibly testing, dosage calibration, civilian subjects with no military connection chosen for—" He stopped. "Chosen for what?" Emma asked. "Demographic vulnerability. No next of kin involvement, limited insurance follow-up, low likelihood of post-discharge monitoring." He said it with the flat effect of someone who had been doing this job long enough to have run out of the right emotional register for information like this. Emma was quiet for 3 seconds. She was thinking about Thomas Carradine, 59. She was thinking about what his last night looked like. The progressive bradycardia in his chart, the nurses who documented it and called for a consult, the consult that didn't come. "Sloane knew what he was looking at," she said. "We believe so," Marsh said. "Then he let Carradine die." Nobody said anything to that. She pulled her attention back to what was in front of her, because the alternative was to sit with that and she couldn't afford it right now. What's Sloane's connection to Northgate? Carver pulled up something on the laptop and turned the screen. A document. Financial records, formatted as a federal exhibit. He received consulting payments through a subsidiary company over an 11-month period, totaling $412,000. The payments correlate with the patient admissions. He was paid per exposure? Emma asked. We don't know that. We know the payments exist and we know the timeline. That's the same thing. Carver didn't argue it. Emma sat back. She was looking at the projected documents on the wall, but she wasn't really seeing them. She was seeing the ER that morning. She was seeing Sloane's face when he'd told her she was just a nurse. She was seeing the moment she'd set her badge on the counter and the particular quality of his confidence in that moment. The certainty of a man who knew he was in control of the environment and believed he always would be. He'd known what was in Bay 7. Not necessarily that it was Hale, maybe not that, but he'd known the presentation. He'd seen it before. 3 times before, at minimum. And he'd walked in and assessed the patient and looked Emma directly in the eye and told her it was dehydration. He'd known. She became aware that the room was waiting for something. "Why am I here?" she asked. Not aggressively. She just needed the answer. Marsh looked at Tambor, then back at her. The chelation sequence for the secondary agent in the compound. You referenced it when you briefed Carver earlier. Delta 7 protocol. Yes. There are 4 people in the continental United States who have the Delta 7 certification. 2 of them are currently deployed. 1 is in a surgical recovery. You're the 4th. Emma looked at Tambor. Tambor met her eyes. I have the compound knowledge. I don't have the surgical certification for the chelation sequence. It requires specific catheter placement in a non-standard configuration that's part of the Delta 7 package. That's a procedural certification, not a medical degree requirement. So you need me in the OR, Emma said. The general's atropine buffer is going to plateau in, Tambor checked her watch, approximately 40 minutes. At that point, the secondary agent resumes cascade. If we don't perform the chelation before that happens, the cardiac involvement becomes irreversible. Emma did the math. It wasn't complicated math. If I'm in the OR, I'm not a witness to whatever you're doing with Sloane. That's a secondary consideration, Marsh said. Is it? A pause. We need you in the OR, Lawson. She looked at the table. She thought about the Delta 7 certification. The 2 weeks she'd spent in a classified training facility outside Colorado Springs, the specific mechanics of the catheter configuration, the way the simulation models had been designed to replicate exactly this scenario. She hadn't used it in 3 years, but she hadn't forgotten it. She didn't forget procedures. She'd been told once by an instructor with very few social skills and very good judgment that she had the rarest kind of medical mind. Not brilliant, not intuitive, but precise. The kind that stored things in the right place and could retrieve them under conditions that would make most people's retrieval systems fail. She'd been annoyed by the qualification at the time. Not brilliant, but standing in it now, she understood what he'd meant as a compliment. Who's my surgeon? She asked. Tambor will supervise. Dr. Vance will manage the standard surgical components. You'll manage the catheter placement and chelation sequence. Vance. She thought about him at the crash cart, the 2-second pause before he told the tech to give her the atropine. He'll follow protocol? He's already been briefed, Tambor said. He asked about you. What did he ask? He asked if you'd been military. Tambor allowed something small to cross her expression. I said yes. He said okay. Emma stood. Let's go, she said. The OR on the 3rd floor had been cleared of everything but the essentials, and the essentials had been reorganized by people who were used to operating in spaces that weren't built for what they were doing. The standard surgical lighting was supplemented by 2 additional mobile units. The equipment Tambor had requisitioned was already unpacked and laid out in the specific order that Delta 7 protocol required, which meant someone with knowledge of that protocol had done the layout, probably Tambor herself, probably in the last 20 minutes. The general was prepped and under monitored sedation when Emma scrubbed in. She could see his chest moving on the monitor from the scrub sink, still slow, still holding, but the atropine curve was beginning to flatten in the way she recognized. 40 minutes had been an optimistic estimate. She had maybe 30. She came through the OR doors and Vance looked up from the sterile field. He was steady, she noted. Tired, processing more than he'd probably anticipated when he'd arrived for his shift this morning, but present in the way that mattered. "Lawson," he said. "Vance." She moved to her position. "I need you to follow my calls on the catheter placement. I'll talk you through what I need from you in real time." "Understood." "If you disagree with a call, say so. I'd rather argue about it than have you silently correct me." He nodded. "Same." Tambor was positioned at the monitoring station. The anesthesiologist, someone Tambor had brought in from the military side, a captain named Reyes who had the look of someone who'd done a lot of things in difficult conditions and was unbothered by one more, adjusted the sedation levels without being asked. "Whenever you're ready," Tambor said. Emma looked at the monitor. She looked at the general's vitals. She looked at the instruments laid out in Delta 7 order on the sterile field. She took a breath. Not to calm herself, her hands were already calm. Just to reset the clock inside her head. The one that had been running since 8:47 that morning when she'd first stood at his bedside and seen something wrong. "Okay," she said. "First placement. Vance, I need 2 centimeters distal from standard. Don't go where you'd normally go. Go where I tell you." "Copy," Vance said. Outside the OR, in the hallway that led back to the elevator, something else was happening. Carver had finished her interview with Sloan at 11:03 a.m. She'd come out of his office with the attaché and the man from federal law enforcement, and she'd said 4 words to the agent standing in the hall that were quiet enough to be professional and clear enough to be unmistakable. Sloan had come out behind her, and he'd looked different than he had at 9/11 when he'd walked onto the ER floor to correct a misunderstanding. The precision was gone. What was underneath it was harder to read. Not scared exactly. More like a man recalculating a position that has just proven to be indefensible. They'd taken him to the elevator. None of that reached Emma in the OR. She was 6 centimeters into a catheter placement that required the steadiness of a much quieter situation than the one she'd been living since dawn. And she was giving it everything she had. The monitor was her whole world. Heart rate 34. Dropping. "I need the chelation agent ready," she said. Reyes confirmed it. "Placement is set," Vance said. "Confirm position," Tambor said from the monitoring station. Emma checked. She checked again. Not because she doubted the first check, but because this was a confirmation step. And confirmation steps existed for the moments when you were right, but needed to be certain before you committed to being right. "Confirmed," she said. "Starting chelation sequence." The agent went in. The first 60 seconds were the ones that could go either way. She'd been told that in training, told it plainly, without softening. There's a window in the first minute where you find out if you got the placement right. And if you didn't, the chelation accelerates the cascade instead of stopping it. And you have about 90 seconds to reverse course before the intervention becomes the cause of death. She watched the monitor. Heart rate 31. Nobody in the room said anything. 29. She held absolutely still. Then 32, 35, 38. Tambor exhaled through her nose. 44. "It's moving," Vance said quietly. "Don't celebrate yet," Emma said. "We need to see it hold." They watched it climb to 52 and stay there for 90 seconds. Then Reyes adjusted sedation and the rate settled at 58. Emma released her breath. "Good placement," Tambor said. That was all she said, but coming from Tambor, it was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Emma stepped back from the sterile field and let Vance close the procedural sequence. She looked at the monitor, at the general's chest rising and falling in the deep, even rhythm of someone whose body had just been pulled back from an edge, and she felt, not triumph, not relief, something quieter than both. The specific satisfaction of a thing done correctly under conditions designed to make it fail. She pulled her gloves and walked toward the scrub sink. It was 11:41 a.m. She'd been in the building for just under 3 hours since coming back through those doors. She turned the faucet on and stood there with the water running over her hands, and for the first time since 8:47 that morning, she let herself stop moving forward and just stand in one place. She was standing there when the OR door opened. Not Vance, not Tambor, Carver. She looked at Emma for a moment across the scrub room, and the expression on her face was the careful, precise expression of someone who is about to deliver information they did not expect to be delivering. "The financial records your intelligence contact referenced," Carver said. "We finished running the full trace." Emma turned off the water. "Northgate Defense Solutions has two primary shareholders," Carver said. "We identified one of them 3 hours ago in connection with the Sloan payments. It's a name you'll see in the next press cycle." "And the second shareholder?" Carver looked at her. "Emma," she said, using her first name for the first time. "The second shareholder is listed under a holding company based in the Cayman Islands. The beneficial owner on the formation documents," she paused, and the pause had weight to it, "is a retired brigadier general named Harris Whitmore." Emma had gone very still. She knew that name, not from a file, not from a briefing. She knew it from the radio call on a deployment she'd never spoken about publicly 3 years ago, in a country she was contractually prohibited from naming. She knew it from the voice on the other end of a satellite phone that had kept cutting out. She knew it because the voice had been giving her instructions for how to treat 3 soldiers who had presented with an organophosphate variant, and the voice had identified himself as the supervising officer on a classified medical program, Harris Whitmore. She looked at Carver. "He was running it," she said. "He was running the compound program." "We believe so." "From inside the military." "From inside the military," Carver confirmed. Emma looked at the wall. The scrub room was white and small and smelled of hospital soap, and none of that mattered, because what she was standing inside now was not a room. It was the edge of something whose full shape she still couldn't see. "He called me this morning," she said. The silence in the room changed entirely. Carver's expression went very still. "I'm sorry?" "Before I came upstairs, a number I didn't have labeled. He told me to stay in the building. He told me this wasn't just about Hale." She turned to look at Carver directly. "I told you I had a call. That was the call. Whitmore called you." "Yes." Carver was quiet for 2 full seconds, and then she lifted her phone and said, "I need a trace on all calls made to Lawson's mobile number beginning at approximately 9:15 this morning. Priority." She lowered the phone. She looked at Emma. "Did he say anything else? Anything about Hale specifically, or about the compound?" "He told me he needed me in the building when the federal team found what was in the records. He said I'd be able to explain what they were looking at. He wanted you here to interpret the evidence." "Yes. Why?" "If he's connected to the compound, because he needed someone with clearance to read the files," Emma said, and she heard her own voice flatten as the shape of it became clear. "Someone the investigation would trust. Someone who'd already flagged the general and been vindicated by the outcome. He needed a credible witness with direct knowledge who would walk federal agents through the compound evidence without knowing she was doing it on his behalf." She heard what she'd just said. So did Carver. "He used you," Carver said. "He tried to," Emma said. And then, before Carver could respond, Emma's phone buzzed again. She looked at the screen. The same unlabeled number. She looked at Carver. Carver looked at her. "Answer it," Carver said, and already had her own phone to her ear. Emma picked up. "Lawson," the voice said. "Whitmore." Composed, professional, the same tone she'd heard 3 years ago on a satellite call that kept cutting out. "I assume the federal team has made some progress. I wanted to check in." Emma kept her voice even. "You should know the general is stable." "Good, that's good. And the Sloan situation?" "I imagine that's moving forward." "It is." "Good," he said again. "You've done well today. I want you to know that. What you did in that ER, it mattered. It's going to matter in ways you don't fully see yet." She looked at Carver, who was making gestures with her free hand that Emma understood without needing them translated. "Why don't you come in?" Emma said, "so we can talk about it properly." A pause. The pause lasted 4 seconds. When he spoke again, something in the voice had changed. Not much, but enough. The composure was still there, but underneath it, something had shifted. "That's a very specific kind of invitation," he said. "It is," Emma said. Another pause. Shorter. "I see." Harris Whitmore said, and the line went dead. Carver was already moving before Emma lowered the phone. She was speaking into her own line in the clipped, sequential language of someone coordinating multiple moving parts simultaneously. Location trace, exit monitoring, airport flags, the specific administrative vocabulary of a net being drawn. She walked out of the scrub room into the hallway, and Emma followed her, not because she'd been told to, but because standing still wasn't something she was capable of right now. "He'll run," Emma said. "Everyone runs," Carver said, not breaking stride. "What matters is where. He'll have anticipated the trace. The number was unlabeled for a reason. Burner phones still touch towers. We have the timestamp and the call duration." Carver pushed through a door into the main corridor. "What I need from you right now is everything you remember from that deployment. Every detail about the compound program, the facility, the chain of command, the personnel you interacted with. That's going to take more than a hallway conversation." "Conference room B, 15 minutes. Carver glanced back. "Can you do that?" Emma thought about whether she could sit in a room and formally debrief a 3-year-old classified operation while running on 4 hours of adrenaline, no food, and the residual focus of a surgical procedure she hadn't performed since her certification refresh. She thought about Thomas Carradine dying at 3:17 a.m. with nurses documenting his deterioration and no consult coming. She thought about Whitmore's voice on the phone, "You've done well today," and the specific quality of his confidence, which was the confidence of a man who had arranged things. "Yes," she said. The 15 minutes turned into 12 because Marsh was already in conference room B when she arrived, with 2 additional people she hadn't seen before. A woman from the Justice Department's National Security Division, whose name was Albright, and who had the focused, slightly remote expression of someone whose career ran on the gap between what was legal and what was provable, and a man from the FBI's counterintelligence unit who introduced himself as Garrett and shook her hand with the grip of someone who wanted her to know he took the room seriously. They sat. Emma talked. She'd never formally debriefed this operation. The non-disclosure framework around her JSOC attachment was layered in a way that had made her feel, for the past 3 years, like she'd been carrying something sealed. Not a secret exactly, but an unprocessed event. She'd treated 3 soldiers. She'd followed instructions from a supervising voice on a satellite phone. She'd kept them alive through a night that she'd classified mentally as the hardest single shift of her career, harder than anything before or after, and then she'd written her medical notes in the required format and submitted them through the required channel and never heard another word about the compound, the program, or the voice on the phone. She told them what the facility looked like. She told them the approximate geographic region, which Marsh already knew and confirmed with a nod. She told them the dosage patterns she'd managed, the symptom progression, the specific way the secondary agent had modified the absorption, things she'd never said aloud because there'd been no one to say them to. Albright was writing. Garrett was recording. Marsh was listening with his eyes on the table, not on her, which was the posture of someone who was hearing things they already knew in a form they could now officially use. "The voice on the phone," Garrett said. "The supervising officer. Did he identify himself by name during that call?" "No," Emma said. "He identified himself by rank and clearance level." "But you recognized Whitmore's voice this morning." She thought about that. The honest answer was complicated. "I recognized the cadence," she said, "the way he structured sentences, the professional register." She paused. "And the specific phrase he used, it mattered. It's going to matter in ways you don't fully see yet. He said something almost identical during the deployment about the compound program, that it was going to matter in ways the field personnel couldn't fully appreciate." The room absorbed that. "That's not voice identification," Albright said. "No," Emma agreed. "It's pattern recognition, which is why I asked him to come in instead of accusing him." Albright looked at her for a moment. "You made that call yourself to invite him in?" "Carver told me to answer. I used my judgment about what to say." Albright's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted toward reassessment. "It was the right call," Marsh said, and nobody argued with him. At 12:14 p.m., the trace team got a location off the burner phone's last tower ping, a cell on the eastern edge of Ashbrook, close to the interstate. Not Whitmore's location, but the direction of movement. Carver relayed it into the room, and the energy shifted immediately, the way energy shifts when something abstract becomes a coordinate. Garrett stood. Albright closed her notebook. They moved with the efficiency of people who had somewhere specific to be. Marsh stayed. When it was just the two of them and Carver, Marsh looked at Emma with the measured directness of someone who had been waiting for the room to clear. "There are 3 things you should know," he said. Emma waited. First, the operation Whitmore was running was not authorized. It was constructed inside a legitimate defense research program and hidden in the budgetary structure in a way that took us 14 months to untangle. He had access, clearance, and institutional cover, and he used all 3. And the compound went to Northgate. Northgate was the commercialization vehicle. The theory, as best we've been able to reconstruct it, is that a weaponized, controlled release version of the compound had significant market value to certain international buyers. The civilian testing, he stopped. Carradine, Morrow, Ostroff, was dosage calibration, proof of concept, documentation that the compound worked in non-military subjects under real-world conditions. Emma kept her expression flat. The second thing, Marsh said, General Hale was not a random target. He was the chair of the oversight committee that was beginning to audit the defense research program Whitmore's operation was nested inside. If Hale died, the audit would likely have been reassigned to a committee member with different institutional relationships. Whitmore was killing the investigation, Emma said. He was trying to. And the third thing? Marsh looked at her steadily. Whitmore's operation file has a personnel attachment. Names of military and civilian individuals who had contact with the program. Your name is on it. The room got quiet in a specific way. I was field personnel on one operation, Emma said carefully. I treated 3 soldiers. I didn't know what program it was connected to. I know that, Marsh said. The file doesn't make that distinction clearly. And before this morning, with no federal investigation active and no public record of your involvement, that wasn't a problem. But now there's a federal investigation, and you're a witness, a treating medic, and potentially a named associate of the program depending on how the defense attorneys read the attachment. He said it without drama. I want you to understand that clearly before the next 12 hours happen. Emma looked at the table. She understood what he was telling her, and she understood why he was telling her now, before Garrett and Albright had the debrief on record. He was giving her the map of the territory she was about to walk through. Do I need a lawyer? She asked. That's your call, Marsh said. What I can tell you is that the federal team's position is that you are a cooperating witness whose actions this morning directly prevented the death of a senior military officer and contributed to the identification of a criminal operation. That position is currently solid. He paused. It stays solid as long as nothing else comes out of that deployment that changes the picture. Nothing will, she said. Then you're fine. He stood. I'd recommend staying in the building for the next few hours. There will be a formal witness statement process once Garrett's team has what they need on Whitmore's location. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. For what it's worth, what you did in that ER this morning, and in the OR, that's not nothing. He left. Emma sat alone in conference room B for approximately 90 seconds, looking at the projection screen that still had the Northgate financial document up on it from earlier. Then she got up, turned the projector off, and went to find coffee. The hospital was running on a strange frequency by mid-afternoon. The ER was operational. It had never fully stopped, because ERs don't have the option, but the 4th floor was partially cordoned. Sloan's office was sealed with federal evidence tape, and the staff were navigating the kind of institutional shock that happens when the person at the top of the hierarchy has been visibly removed by people with federal credentials. Darlene found Emma in the break room at 1:07 p.m. with a cup of vending machine coffee that was not good but was hot, and that was enough. You doing okay? Darlene asked. Emma considered the question. I've had stranger mornings. Darlene sat down across from her. She was 61, had seen enough hospital politics to have opinions about all of it, and she'd been watching Emma since early morning with an expression that had shifted 3 or 4 times into something that wasn't quite guilt, but was adjacent to it. I should have pushed harder, Darlene said. When you came to me about Base 7, I flagged it, but I didn't. I could have escalated past Vance myself. I had the seniority. Emma looked at her. You did what you could do. That's a kind way to say I deferred when I shouldn't have. That's a fair way to say it too, Emma said. She wasn't going to give Darlene a clean absolution because it wouldn't have been honest and Darlene wasn't asking for dishonesty. But you also confirmed my blood pressure read and got the repeat EKG ordered. That mattered. Darlene nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment. Who are you? She asked. Not unkindly, more like someone who had been wondering for 8 months and had finally decided the question was permissible. A nurse? Emma said. Emma. A nurse who used to do other things, Emma said. That's genuinely all. Darlene looked at her for a long moment, and then seemed to decide that was going to have to be enough, because it was clearly all Emma intended to give. She stood, straightened her scrubs, and said, Vance is asking about you. He's been asking since he came out of the OR. I'll find him. She found Vance at 123 in the hallway outside the ER, sitting on a bench that existed for family members waiting on news and was occasionally used by staff who needed 20 feet of separation from the floor. He was still in his scrubs. He had a water bottle he hadn't opened. He looked up when she approached, and there was something in his face that was working through multiple layers of the morning at once. The competence questions, the authority questions, the specific weight of having been in an OR while a federal investigation played out 40 feet away. She's going to be okay, he said. He meant the general, using the wrong pronoun by accident, correcting himself. Is he stable, Emma said. Tambor's managing the clearance monitoring. He'll be in observation for at least 48 hours, but the cascade was stopped. He'll recover. Vance nodded. He looked at the floor. I almost didn't give you the atropine. I know. 2 more seconds, and I would have told you to leave again. I know that too. He looked up. What would have happened? Emma considered how honest to be. His rate was at 32 when I got there. The standard crash protocol for that presentation would have bought maybe 15 minutes before the secondary agent overrode it. You would have called it cardiac arrest of undetermined origin. The same notation as Thomas Carradine. She watched him understand that without saying it. I didn't know, he said. You couldn't have. You didn't have the frame of reference. You tried to give it to me. You came to me at the station. Vance. She said his name to stop the loop. You made the right call when it counted. That's what matters in this job. You don't get points for the path to the right call. You get points for making it. He was quiet for a moment. Is that something they teach in your unit? Or is that just you? Just me, she said. And it's not always true, but it's true enough. She left him on the bench and walked back toward the ER entrance, and she was halfway there when her phone buzzed with a number she recognized. Carver. We have him, Carver said. Emma stopped walking. Whitmore. He was moving toward the interstate. We had a roadblock set up based on the tower ping, and his registered vehicle came through it at 1:34 p.m. A pause. He didn't try anything. He stopped. He had a bag in the back seat. He's in federal custody. Emma let out a breath through her nose. How is he? Calm, Carver said, and the word had a complicated quality to it. He's been calm since the stop. He asked for his attorney before they finished reading him his rights, that's the behavior of someone who has been thinking about this moment for a long time. He knew this was possible. He built contingencies, Carver said. We found 3 exit routes pre-planned in documentation on his laptop. He was using the second one when we got to him. What was the first one? The first one, Carver said, involved you. Emma was very still. His operational plan. And I want to be careful about how I say this because we're still going through the documentation. His operational plan had a contingency in which you were positioned as the primary witness to the compound's efficacy. Not just a cooperating witness, a documented participant. The deployment records, the medical notes you filed, the satellite call logs, they were all structured in his files as evidence of your knowing involvement in the program. Emma felt something cold move through her. He was going to frame me, she said. If he couldn't run clean, yes. He would have surfaced the deployment file with your name on it and let the investigation chase you while he moved. Carver's voice was even, professional, but underneath it something that might have been anger in someone with more room for it. You were his contingency exit. Emma stood in the middle of the Silvercrest lobby and looked at nothing in particular. She thought about the phone call that morning. "You've done well today." And the specific warmth in it, the paternalistic approval of a man who believed he was managing an asset. She thought about how she'd answered his second call. "Why don't you come in, so we can talk about it properly?" She thought about the 4 seconds of silence before he'd responded, and the way the composure in his voice had shifted in that pause, the first fault line appearing. He'd realized she knew, and he'd still been reaching for the exit. "The deployment file," she said, "the one with my name on it. What's the status?" "Classified and sealed under the investigation. It's evidence, not a public record. Your name is in it, but in context, the full context that Marsh outlined. The frame doesn't hold once we have Whitmore's operational documentation." Another pause. "Emma, you're not in legal jeopardy here. I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. "I'm not worried about the legal jeopardy." "What are you worried about?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. That he'd already decided I was usable before this morning. That I'd been in his operational plan as a contingency for, months? And I was here treating his target and drinking bad coffee and not knowing any of it. The silence on the line was Carver not having a good answer for that, because there wasn't one. "We're going to need your formal statement tomorrow morning," Carver said finally. "Tonight you should rest. Is there somewhere you can go?" "Yes," Emma said, because there was an apartment 12 minutes from the hospital where she'd lived for 8 months, and it was quiet. And right now quiet was what she needed. She ended the call and stood in the lobby of Silvercrest Medical Center and looked at the entrance doors, the same doors she'd walked through at 6:48 that morning, and been walked out of at 9:14, and come back through 3 minutes later with her phone in her hand and a general dying one corridor away. The day had the late afternoon quality of things beginning to settle, the particular institutional exhale of a place that has been through something and is starting tentatively to return to its own rhythms. A family was at the front desk asking about a patient. An orderly was moving a wheelchair through the main corridor. The overhead lighting had the flat, persistent brightness that hospitals never turn down. She was about to walk out when Administrator Gerald Fitch appeared from the direction of the administrative suite, moving with the careful speed of a man who had been waiting for the right moment and had decided this was it. He was 60, silver-haired, with the practiced concern of someone who had spent 2 decades managing situations that required appearing to care while actually managing liability. "Ms. Lawson," he said. He extended his hand. "I've been hoping to speak with you." She looked at his hand. She shook it, because not shaking it would have required energy she wasn't spending on him. "I want you to know," he said, "that the hospital's actions this morning, specifically the employment action taken against you, are being reviewed. In light of everything that's come to light today, I think we both understand that what happened this morning was," he searched for the word, "deeply unfortunate, and that the hospital's position going forward will reflect a more complete understanding of the situation." Emma looked at him. He was managing her. He'd been managing crises for 2 decades, and he was managing her now, in the lobby, in the careful language of institutional damage control. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "is the general alive?" He blinked. Yes, he is. From what I understand, is Thomas Carradine alive?" The name landed on him. She watched him process whether he should pretend not to know it yet. "That situation is, he came through your ER 6 weeks ago," she said, "with the same presentation I flagged this morning, and he died at 3:17 a.m. because a consult was denied." She kept her voice level, not angry, just specific. "I'm not interested in the hospital's review of my employment action. I'm interested in what this hospital does about the patients who didn't have someone walking back through the door for them." Fitch opened his mouth, then closed it. "The federal investigation will address the clinical decisions," Emma said. "But whatever comes after that, the protocols, the oversight, the documentation standards that let a flagged presentation get cleared by a single physician with no second review, that's the part that's yours to answer for." She walked past him toward the doors. She was 3 feet from the exit when her phone rang for the 3rd time that day with an unlabeled number. Not the same string of digits as Whitmore's burner, a different number entirely. She stopped. She stood in the lobby doorway with the cool afternoon air coming in from outside and looked at the screen. Answered. Miss Lawson, a woman's voice, clipped, official, the register of someone who chose her words based on their precision rather than their warmth. This is Colonel Patricia Sayers, Office of the Army Surgeon General. I'm calling because we've been monitoring the situation at Silvercrest Medical Center today, and there are some things that need to be discussed. I've already spoken with federal investigators, Emma said, and DIA. I know, this isn't about the investigation. A pause. This is about you specifically, and a conversation that should have happened 3 years ago when you separated from service. Emma looked at the lobby behind her, at Fitch still standing where she'd left him, at the doors ahead and the parking lot in Patromosa and the afternoon beyond it. What kind of conversation, she said. The kind where we explain what you were actually part of, Sayers said, and what we need you to understand before the investigation goes public. Because once it does... Another pause, shorter this time, with a different quality to it. There are things in your deployment record that the current investigation will expose, and you need to know what they are before you read them in a federal exhibit. The lobby hummed around her, fluorescent light, distant intercom, the sounds of a building continuing to operate through the wreckage of its own day. What things? Emma said. Ms. Lawson. Sayers' voice was careful now, very careful. The 3 soldiers you treated on that deployment, the ones you kept alive through the night using Whitmore's instructions. Yes? Those soldiers were not field casualties. Emma's hand tightened on the phone. They were program subjects, Sayers said, volunteer participants in a classified compound trial. And the reason Whitmore was on that satellite call giving you instructions, a pause that felt like a door opening onto something she hadn't known was there, was because he needed documented outcomes from a military medic with no program affiliation. He needed clean data. You were the clean data. The lobby went very quiet around Emma Lawson. She stood in the doorway of Silvercrest Medical Center and understood in a single expanding instant that the morning she'd been carrying sealed inside her for 3 years, the hardest shift of her career, the night she'd saved 3 soldiers, the operation she'd never spoken about, had been something else entirely. And Whitmore had known it, and he had called her this morning into this building because he'd needed her here, her clearance, her credibility, her documented medical skill, not just as a contingency exit, as the final piece of a cover that was already unraveling. She had one question. The soldiers, she said, are they alive? The pause on the other end of the line lasted exactly long enough to tell her that the answer was not simple. The pause lasted 4 seconds. In Emma's experience, 4 seconds was a long time for someone with Colonel Sayers' particular brand of precision to leave a question unanswered. 2 of them are alive, Sayers said. The 3rd died 8 months after the deployment. The official cause was listed as complications from a prior injury. Emma stood in the doorway and did not move. Was it? She asked. We don't know yet. That's part of what the investigation is now going to address. Sayers' voice had the careful, measured quality of someone delivering information they would have preferred to deliver differently, in a different room, with more time to structure it. Ms. Lawson, I want to be direct with you. What Whitmore built was designed to be invisible. He used legitimate program infrastructure, legitimate personnel, legitimate medical personnel, people like you who had no reason to question the context they were given. The culpability is his. What I need you to understand is that the investigation is going to make all of this visible, publicly, and your name is going to appear in documents that don't currently contain the context that exonerates you. You're telling me to get ahead of it. I'm telling you that the Army's position, the official position, on record, is that you were an unwitting participant whose actions on that deployment and whose actions today represent exactly the kind of medical integrity the program was designed to exploit. You were targeted because you were good, because you were clean, because Whitmore needed someone who wouldn't ask the questions that would have unraveled him 3 years earlier. A pause. That's the statement we're prepared to make publicly. Emma looked at the parking lot outside the lobby doors. The afternoon light was the flat gray of an Oregon overcast, the kind that didn't decide to be rain and didn't decide to be clear. A federal vehicle was parked at an angle near the main entrance that it hadn't been parked at this morning, which was a small specific marker of how much the day had changed the geography of this building. "The two soldiers who are alive," Emma said. "Do they know what the trial was?" "They're being notified today." She thought about what that notification looked like. Two people, somewhere, learning that the thing they'd volunteered for, whatever they'd been told it was, had been something else in the hands of the man running it. She thought about what it felt like to have the ground shift under a memory you'd been carrying as solid. She knew that feeling now, personally. "Okay," she said, "we'll need your formal cooperation with the investigation going forward. That includes a recorded debrief on the deployment, a review of the medical documentation you filed at the time, and potentially testimony." "I know," Emma said. "I'll cooperate." "Good." Sayers paused one more time, and when she spoke again, the official register had dropped a fraction. Not much, but enough to hear the person underneath it. "For what it's worth, what you did today, walking back into that building, making that call, performing that procedure, none of that was owed to anyone. You'd been fired. You had every reason to keep walking." Emma didn't respond to that immediately. She thought about whether it was true. She thought about the man in Bay 7, the tremor in his hand, the specific knowledge she'd carried into that parking lot like something she hadn't chosen to carry. "I had a reason to go back," she said. "It just wasn't about owing anyone anything." She ended the call and walked out of Silvercrest Medical Center into the gray afternoon, and she drove home, and she slept for 9 hours without dreaming. Boats. The days that followed were not clean. Nothing about them suggested the tidy resolution of a situation fully understood. They had the texture of institutional machinery beginning to move, slow, loud in specific ways, and silent in others, full of procedural steps that felt interminable when you were inside them. Emma gave her formal recorded statement on Tuesday morning in a federal building in Portland, with Albright from Justice and Garrett from Counterintelligence and a court reporter whose keyboard made a sound like distant rain. She talked for 4 hours. She was precise because precision was the only thing she knew how to offer, and she had learned a long time ago that precision was the most powerful thing she had. Harris Whitmore was arraigned on Thursday. The charges were extensive and read in the flat, accumulated language of a federal indictment: conspiracy to commit murder, unlawful human experimentation, bribery of a public official, obstruction of a federal investigation, wire fraud, and 7 additional counts that the Justice Department's press release summarized as relating to the unauthorized development and deployment of a classified biological compound for commercial purposes. He appeared in court in a suit that cost more than Emma's monthly rent, and stood with the composed, slightly remote expression of a man who had decided that composure was the last thing he could control. It wasn't. His attorney entered a not guilty plea, and the judge set a trial date, and the federal prosecutor told the assembled press outside the courthouse that the government's case was, in her words, comprehensive. Emma watched it on the news from her apartment. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something more complicated. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been inside an event for a long time and is now watching its edges from the outside and is not entirely sure how to locate herself in relation to it. Victor Sloan's case moved faster. His attorney negotiated with federal prosecutors over the course of 2 weeks, and on a Wednesday morning that smelled like rain coming, the agreement was announced. Sloan had agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation into Northgate Defense Solutions and Harris Whitmore in exchange for a reduced charge: 1 count of criminal negligence resulting in death, 1 count of bribery. He would not practice medicine again. His license was surrendered the same day permanently, and the Oregon Medical Board statement used language that left no ambiguity about the finality of that decision. Emma read the board statement on her phone while she was eating lunch. She read it twice. Then she put her phone face down on the table and sat with the particular feeling of something being over, not resolved in the way that made wounds close cleanly, but concluded in the way that meant the open thing had finally been named and documented and given its correct weight. Thomas Carradine had a daughter named Blythe who was 34 and lived in Portland. Emma found this out through the investigation process, not through any deliberate search. Blythe Carradine had contacted federal investigators after Sloan's arrest became public, and her name appeared in a case file Emma was shown during one of her follow-up sessions with Garrett. She thought about writing her a letter. She thought about it for 3 days. She didn't know what she would say that would be true without being insufficient, so she didn't write it, and she carried that unresolved the way she suspected she was going to carry it for a long time. Some things don't resolve. That was something nobody had told her in any training, in any protocol, in any classified briefing. It was something you accumulated. General Marcus Hale was transferred to a military medical facility on day 4, when his condition was stable enough for transport. Before he left Silvercrest, he asked to speak with Emma. She hadn't expected that. Carver had relayed the request with the neutral efficiency of someone transmitting information without editorializing, and Emma had said yes and gone to his room on the 6th floor where he'd been moved for observation, and she'd knocked on the open door and found him sitting up in the bed with the alert, watchful quality of a man who was still calculating the room from instinct, even though the room was a hospital and the calculation was academic. He looked better than he had when she'd seen him in Base 7. The color had come back. His eyes were clear in the specific way that meant the neurological interference had cleared, a quality she'd been trained to assess and was relieved to see. "Sit down," he said, which was more command than invitation, but she sat anyway. He looked at her for a moment, the assessing look she'd seen briefly through his diminished consciousness in the ER, now fully present. "I've been reading your service record," he said. "You have clearance for that." "I do." He didn't apologize for it. 7 years attached to JSOC Medical, 3 classified deployments, cited for field performance twice, both times in documentation that won't appear in any public database. He paused. "And then you separated. Came here." "Yes." Why Ashbrook? She thought about how to answer that honestly. "It was quiet. I needed quiet for a while. And then you spent 8 months being treated like you didn't know what you were doing." "That happens," she said. "It shouldn't." "No," she agreed, "it shouldn't. But it does, and the way through it isn't to announce yourself. The way through it is to do your job and wait for the moment where it matters." She said it without bitterness, because she'd processed the bitterness somewhere around Tuesday evening, and what was left was something flatter and more durable. "That's what I did." He looked at her for a long moment. "The procedure in the OR, the collation sequence. Tambor supervised. Tambor told me you placed the catheter in a configuration she's only seen performed correctly twice in 30 years of military medicine." He said it plainly, not as a compliment exactly, more as a statement of fact that he felt she should have in her possession. She said the second time she saw it performed correctly was in a simulation, by an instructor. The first time was by a staff sergeant in a field hospital in a location she's prohibited from naming. Emma said nothing. "Was that you?" he asked. She looked at him. "I've performed the procedure a number of times in training environments," she said, which was technically accurate and also not an answer, and he knew it. Something shifted in his expression that might, on a different face, have been a smile. "The Army wants to offer you something," he said. "Not me personally, though I support it. The Surgeon General's office coordinating with the investigation. Given your role in this, given your service record, given what Whitmore did with your deployment file and the fact that your name is about to appear in federal documents, they want to make a public record that accurately reflects who you are and what you did." Sayers mentioned that. This is beyond what Sayers mentioned. He shifted his weight, and something in the movement told her it still cost him something, his body still working through the residue of a compound that had nearly stopped it. "There's going to be a public statement, on record, attributed to my office and the Surgeon General's office jointly. It will name what Whitmore's program was, what it used, and who it targeted. And it will name you, specifically, as the medic whose field work Whitmore exploited and whose independent action on the morning of this incident prevented my death and directly enabled the federal investigation that is now dismantling his operation." Emma was quiet. "That's a public record," she said. "Yes." "My service has been classified. The statement will be coordinated with the relevant classification authorities. The operational details stay sealed. Your identity as a veteran and your role in this specific incident do not." He looked at her steadily. "This isn't something I can force you to accept. You have the right to remain out of the public record entirely. But I want you to understand what it means if you accept it, what was done to you. The exploitation, the dismissal, the way Whitmore built his plan around your credibility while keeping you in the dark, goes on record, not just in a federal case file, publicly. Emma looked at the window. The same gray sky. Oregon had a particular relationship with gray that she'd learned to read the way she read vital signs. Not as absence of light, but as its own kind of light. And the commendation, she said, that's part of it too. Yes, the Army wants to formally commend your actions. It would be a military commendation issued to a retired service member, which is, it's not standard. But nothing about this situation is standard. She thought about what it meant to have her name in a public record after 8 years of deliberate absence from one. She thought about the quietness of Ashbrook, which she'd chosen. She thought about Blythe Carradine, whose father had died on a night when the consult didn't come. She thought about the 2 surviving soldiers being notified somewhere that the program they'd been part of was not what they'd been told. She thought about the things Sayers had said on the phone. You were targeted because you were good. That was the part that had stayed with her, not as a wound, but as a clarification. She'd spent 8 months at Silvercrest being treated as someone who didn't know what she was doing, and she'd carried the knowledge of her own competence quietly, without announcement, because that was how she'd been trained, and also because something in her had believed that the right moment would come, that doing the job correctly would eventually be enough. It had been. But not in the way she'd imagined. It had been enough in a much larger way than an ER shift and a decent performance review and gradually earning the respect of a charge nurse and a resident. It had been enough in the specific, consequential way that mattered most. When the stakes were the highest they could be, and no one else had the piece she had, and she'd used it. Okay, she said. Yes, but... The public statement was released on a Friday, 3 weeks after the morning that had started with a man in Bay 7 and a tremor in his right hand. Emma was not present for its release. She was working a shift in the ER at Silvercrest, which was operational and short-staffed as it always was, and she found out the statement had gone public when Darlene showed her phone across the nurse's station with an expression that had something in it Emma hadn't seen on Darlene's face before, something that looked like it might be awe, except that Darlene was not generally a person who did awe. Emma read the first 3 paragraphs. Then she handed the phone back and went to check on the patient in Bay 3, who had a laceration that needed suturing and had been waiting for 12 minutes longer than he should have. The hospital's response was institutional and therefore imperfect and also, in its way, genuine. Gerald Fitch appeared in the ER that afternoon with the energy of a man who had been coached by legal counsel and was trying to locate his actual feelings underneath the coaching. He asked if Emma would be willing to meet with the hospital board. She said yes, on the condition that the meeting included a clinical review committee, because what she wanted to talk about was documentation protocols and the chain of review for flagged vital signs, not her own employment status. He blinked. He said he'd arrange it. Vance found her in the break room after shift and said, I saw the statement. He looked like he was working up to something. She waited. I nominated you for the ER's clinical leadership committee. I don't know if that means anything given, he gestured vaguely at the scope of the last 3 weeks. Everything. But I wanted you to know. It means something, she said. And it did. Not because it was large, but because it was his, and it was honest. 6 weeks after the morning with the general, on a Tuesday with actual sun for once, Emma stood in a room at the Federal Building in Portland with 9 other people including Carver, Marsh, Tambor, Garrett, and General Hale, who had recovered with the systematic efficiency of a man who had decided his body owed him function and had collected on that debt, and received a military commendation that was read aloud in language so specific and so accurate about what she had actually done that it took her a moment to recognize herself in it. She stood straight and received it without looking away, which was harder than any procedure she'd performed, because it required her to simply be present for something being said about her that was true, in front of people who had witnessed the truth of it, and not deflect. Hale handed it to her and held her hand for a moment, not a handshake, something steadier than that, and said, "The record is correct now." "Yes," she said. "It is." Afterward, outside on the courthouse steps in the November sun, Carver stood beside her and they watched the street for a moment without talking. Carver had the posture of someone who was very rarely still and was choosing to be still for 60 seconds before the next thing. "What happens now?" Carver asked. Emma thought about the clinical review committee, the documentation protocol she'd already drafted, the board meeting Fitch had scheduled for December, the follow-up debrief sessions that would continue through the new year as the Whitmore case moved toward trial, the two soldiers somewhere who were alive. "Work," Emma said. Carver made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That's it?" "That's most of it." Emma looked at the street. "And the rest of it is just living with what you know, carrying it without letting it make you into something smaller." Carver was quiet for a moment. "Is that hard?" "Sometimes," Emma said. "Less than it used to be." She walked down the courthouse steps into the afternoon, commendation in her jacket pocket, the weight of it small and real, and she thought about something she'd understood that morning in a way she hadn't fully understood before. Not as a lesson, because lessons implied someone had been there to teach it, and no one had been there to teach her any of the things that had made her who she was. She'd learned it the hard way, the way most true things get learned, by doing the job when the job asked for everything, by being dismissed and returning anyway, by carrying knowledge that no one believed she had, until the moment arrived when disbelief became impossible. There are people in every room that a room doesn't know how to see. People who have been somewhere the room has never been, who have done something the room has never witnessed, who carry a precision and a capability that doesn't announce itself because it was never trained to announce. It was trained to function, to keep working, to find the next right action and do it, regardless of who's watching, regardless of whether anyone will know. They are not waiting for the room to figure it out. They are not performing patience. They are simply doing what they do, with the steady, unshakable knowledge that the work is real, whether anyone validates it or not. And that when the moment comes, when the stakes arrive and the room runs out of answers, the work will speak in a language that cannot be argued with. Emma Lawson had always known who she was,